In this video, I'm going to build the RE.2000. It is made almost entirely of plastic parts. The only photo etch part is the propeller that has been provided by Flyhawk in the detail upgrade kit. All the plastic parts are molded in clear plastic. This allows me to create a clear canopy for the aircraft, which is quite a nice feature. Although with windows this small, it's going to be difficult to create a window effect with this plastic in any case. I'll attempt to make clear windows by spraying the canopy in the color of the fuselage and then use a toothpick to scratch out the paint where the windows should be. According to the painting guide, the aircraft must be painted in a dark green. I did a color conversion for the paint guide, and the matched color for Tamiya is XF11 JN green. And there are also a few decals that need to be applied to the aircraft. Since I'm unsure as to how these windows will turn out on the canopy, I'm going to spray just the canopy first and then attempt to scratch out the windows to see if I can create a good effect. These windows are incredibly small, so I know it's going to be quite difficult to get them cleanly scratched out. These windows are very small, but the point of the toothpick is small enough to get within the borders of the window. If the windows were any smaller, I'd use a knife to sharpen the end of the toothpick a bit to make it a little bit more precise. I'm being very gentle as I scrape off the paint. I'm trying to stick within the lines of the window. For a part this small, even once the paint is scraped off, it's very difficult to see the window. I think it looks reasonable. You only really notice the defects when you look at it zoomed in on a camera. When you're viewing it with your eye, it looks just fine. I have gone over the lines in the windows in some locations. I'm just going to need to touch that up a little bit with some paint and a brush. But in general, I think it looks fairly good, especially when you're looking at it with your naked eye. So I'll leave it like that and move on to cutting off all of the parts from the sprue and then preparing them for assembly. As always, once the parts are removed from the sprue, they need to be cleaned up. And I use a fine file to remove the points where the part was attached to the sprue. And if necessary, I clean up the edges with a 1000 grit sanding sponge. Some of these parts are very awkward to grip, they're just very small. So I'll try to hold them in tweezers, but they move around quite a lot. It's just quite awkward to hold. I actually need some rubberized tweezers to be able to hold these parts more securely. Metal on hard plastic just kind of slips by and it becomes quite difficult to grip the part. I'm going to glue these parts together with extra thin plastic cement. Before I apply the glue, I'm going to tape the two halves of the fuselage together. The tape will just hold the fuselage together while it's drying. And then I'll apply extra thin plastic cement to the seam line to bond them together. While the fuselage is drying, I'll attach the cowling. I think it's a cowling. It's just this circular structure that goes at the front of the fuselage that covers the engine. I think that's a cowling. Anyways, as with the fuselage, I put it in place dry. Well, as dry as it can be, there was a bit of glue from when I stuck the fuselage together. And then I apply extra thin super glue to the seam line so that it can be bonded properly into place. While the fuselage is in this state, I can also install the horizontal stabilizers. There is a small notch at the base of the vertical stabilizer for the horizontal stabilizers to slot into. The hole is a bit obstructed, so I have to take some time to open it up. I fight with it quite a bit while I try to get things in, not realizing it's partially blocked. Eventually I figure it out and use a hobby knife to cut the hole a little bit larger. Another mistake that I made when installing the horizontal stabilizers is that I used this extra thin plastic cement. And what I didn't realize at the time is that it's much more slow drying, and even a few days after installation, the glue still had not properly set on this plastic. When I install the horizontal stabilizers on the RO43, I'm going to use Revell Contactor Professional Glue instead. It will create a much stronger bond and do it a lot more quickly. Anyways, after a bit of back and forth, I am able to get the stabilizers into the notch and in place. I then spend a lot of time trying to position them correctly. Probably being overly pedantic, and because this glue isn't gripping very well at this stage, they do move under gravity. So after eventually getting them into a position that I found satisfactory, I stood the fuselage up on its nose and left it to dry for a few hours. I then had a bit of a moment and started working on the planes, but forgot to turn on the cameras. Yeah, that's unfortunate. So at this point you see the wings are attached and the glue has already partially dried. At this point I'm just maneuvering them still, trying to make sure that they are in a good position and even at the same angles, straight, and in a state that I am happy with. These wings didn't have any notches or anything to slip into. They're just attached to the base of the fuselage with these parts that stick out from the side. It's not the ideal way of connecting them because you don't have much of a guide for getting them aligned correctly, but it's good enough. Now to stick the painted canopy onto the fuselage. Once again, I'm using extra thin plastic cement to glue it in place. Plastic cement is very slow drying, so that gives me plenty of time to position the canopy into the correct location. After letting everything dry for a few hours, I then moved on to installing the landing gear. The glue in the bottle is Revell Contactor Professional. I decant it from the bottles that it comes in because those nozzles always get blocked and I find them quite frustrating. I find it is best to apply this glue with a wire or toothpick, or in some cases when I need to apply a lot of it, I use an old paintbrush. For the landing gear, because it has a short stalk that the wheel is attached to, I dip that end into the glue and then I place it in the hole in the wing, which indicates the location where the gear must be installed. Although these parts are very small, this is by no means the most tricky part of the aircraft to install. If anything, I'll say that the thing that gave me the most trouble were the horizontal stabilizers. As I previously said, the glue took a very long time to dry and I kept on moving them and knocking them out of position. I think I even broke them off a few times. They were quite frustrating to work with, actually. While the landing gear dry, I can then work on some touch-up to the canopy. After cutting the canopy off the sprue, it did require some cleanup. So I had used a file to remove the connection point to the sprue. And in the process of doing that, obviously I had scuffed the paint, and obviously there was no paint where the attachment point was. So there was this small gap in the paint coverage that I wanted to touch up. The intention being that I'll tape off the entirety of the canopy and then spray the rest of the aircraft and preserve the scratched out windows that I had previously done. Definitely would have been easier to assemble the aircraft fully and then not apply tape. Or I suppose I could just repaint the entire things and scratch out the windows again. But you know, sometimes I like to create work for myself. So in this case, I decided to tape off the canopy. This is 3mm thick masking tape, and it's just big enough to cover the windows on the canopy. So slightly tricky masking to apply, but not so bad. Certainly quicker than re-scraping out all the windows. So I suppose it makes sense that I taped it off rather than re-scratching out the windows. Once taped off, the entire aircraft is sprayed in XF11. This is an acrylic paint and it dries very quickly. A few minutes after spraying one of the wings, I'm able to hold it by that wing and then spray the other wing and the whole aircraft from a different angle. While the paint is drying, I'll work on the propeller. My initial thought is to try and preserve the plastic propeller. It doesn't look too bad to me. It's a bit out of scale, but it might be nicer than the photo-etch propeller because it has that more three-dimensional look to it. But while handling it, it has become quite clear why there is a photo-etch part. It's basically impossible to clean up the blades without breaking them off the shaft. So after trying a lot to get the blades cleaned up, and after trying to insert the propeller into the engine, I in the end just gave up and decided, you know what, I've got the photo-etch propellers, so I might as well break off these plastic parts, cut off the top of the shaft, and install the photo-etch propeller instead. So that is what I do. The shaft can quite easily be inserted into the aircraft. Once again, I use plastic cement to glue the part in place. While the shaft is drying, I move on to some more painting work. The tires and the landing gear need to be painted. Right now they are in a dark green color, which is obviously not an appropriate color for rubber. So I get out some XF1, just normal black and a very fine paintbrush, and I paint the rubber on the tires black. Although the tires are very small, this is surprisingly not tricky. I would have thought that it would be more difficult, but the way the plastic is molded makes the paint run quite easily to where it needs to go and keeps it out of the hub at the center of the wheel. I think that is more luck than design. But hey, when things are going well, take the win. The prop shaft has now sufficiently dried such that I can paint it as well. I'm going to paint the propellers in XF54, so I'll also paint the prop shaft and the inside of the cowling in XF54. In this case, I'm applying the paint mostly to the shaft and letting it run down into the cowling. That way I can avoid, as much as possible, getting paint on the outside of the cowling. I'm also going to paint the propellers at this time. There's no point in using an airbrush to do this work. These parts are all too small to be able to tell the difference between a paintbrush and an airbrush painted part. This paint is very thin, so I do put on quite a lot, with the understanding that it is mostly solvent and that solvent will evaporate off and leave a good thin layer of paint. After letting the paint on the propeller and prop shaft dry, the propeller can now be installed. To install the propeller, I apply a small drop of extra thick superglue to the top of the shaft and then place the propeller on the top of the shaft. As what may come as somewhat of a surprise to people that have been following this channel for a while now, I am not overly concerned about the orientation of the propeller. People watching this channel might expect me to want to position the propeller in a symmetrical way, but I actually don't really mind how it's positioned. In fact, I think if it was positioned to make the aircraft look perfectly symmetrical, you might be entering that uncanny valley, in which case it kind of would make everything look a bit weird. Or uncanny, I suppose. While working with photo-etch, I also construct the carriage and the stand that the aircraft sits on, and not on the catapult. Although they look fairly complicated, in effect these are just boxes with open bottoms. So these are about as simple as they can be to fold. The connection points between the sides of these boxes is quite thin, so you don't actually even really need tweezers to bend them. You can bend them with your fingers, but at this point I hadn't quite figured that out, so I use tweezers to do it anyway. Once folded into their correct shape, I then use a wire and some extra thin superglue to glue the edges together. Once the glue has had a moment to dry, I place the assembled aircraft onto the carriage to do a quick test fit. Since everything looks good, I'll move on to applying the glass coat. Normally at this point, you'd hear me talk about applying the glass coat to prepare the part for weathering, but that's not what this glass coat is for. That's going to be a later glass coat. This glass coat is being applied so that I can correctly apply the decals. It's very important to apply decals onto a glass coat, because if you apply it onto a matte coat, then little air bubbles will be trapped underneath it, and on the clear parts of the decal, you'll get a silvering effect. It'll literally look like there's a silver backing to the decal. Obviously, you don't want that. You want it to be perfectly transparent. So to avoid that silvering effect, first spray your part where you're going to apply the decal in a glass coat, and then put the decal on top of the glass coat. You don't need to spray the entire part. In this case, because the parts are so small, I will spray the entire aircraft in the glass coat. But on ships where there's a number on the bow or stern or something like that, what I normally do in the past is just spray the area where I'm going to apply the decal instead of the entire ship. You also need to take into account the order in which you're going to apply your effects to the model. Often you'll want your weathering to go on top of the decals. That's why I say at this point, the reason why I'm spraying these in glass coat is not to weather, but to apply the decal. After the decals have been applied, I'll spray the model again in another glass coat to seal in the decals and to provide the base on which I can then perform the weathering. For the stand, well, that I'm also spraying in a glass coat now, and that will be for weathering because there's no decals going onto it. So I might as well do it now because I have the paint loaded up. Now we move on to decals, something that I've yet to do on this channel. To apply the decals, I use lukewarm water to moisten the decal and remove it from the card that it is attached to. Before applying the decal to the model, I put a little bit of microset on the model. Microset is a very weak acid that will help soften the decal This helps the decal adhere to the model. It also makes it such that it is able to move into the fine detail lines. You'll actually be able to see detail that sits underneath the decal if you apply microset to it. Decals this small can be a bit tricky. They don't always go where you want them to go. So if they're out of position, I will try to rehydrate it with microset. And I'm using a toothpick and tweezers and a knife in some occasions to position the decal into the correct location. This can be a bit of a tedious process. There's lots of backwards and forwards to get everything right. It requires patience and perseverance. But that's kind of what building a model really is: patience and perseverance. Once the decal's in position, I absorb the excess microset. Once the excess microset has been removed, these decals are pretty well stuck down, but if you don't cover them with a layer of varnish, they will come off after some time. Putting on a layer of varnish over the decal seals it in and makes it such that you can safely handle the model without having to worry about the decals coming off. After working my way around the entire aircraft and installing all the decals, it's now ready to be sealed in with the second layer of gloss varnish. This layer of varnish is performing two roles. Firstly, it's going to make sure that the decals don't come off, and secondly, it is going to be the layer onto which I apply the panel line to help bring out the details on these aircraft. Applying the panel line to the aircraft is the same as with every other part of the ship. I just put it on without much concern for where it goes or how much of a mess it makes, because I know that with mineral turpentine it can be very easily removed, especially if it's been applied on top of a gloss coat. After letting the panel line dry for around 10 minutes, I then use a brush wet with mineral turpentine to remove the excess. After letting the parts dry for around a day, just to make sure that all the enamel paint and turpentine is properly evaporated off and that the paint has set, I then apply a layer of matte varnish. I don't want these aircraft to be fully matted down. I think the aircraft should have almost a semi-gloss effect to them. They definitely shouldn't be this glossy. They look very weird. They also shouldn't be completely flat. That would also look a bit weird. So I'm going to do a light layer of XF86 from Tamiya, which already doesn't have a very strong matte effect, and I think that will get them into a nice space for their matte effect. And now for the final stage of assembly, installing the aircraft onto the ship. First, I attach the stand for the aircraft to the rails just forward of the catapult using extra thick superglue that I pre-applied to the base of the stand. And then I place the aircraft on top of the stand. That has got to be about the simplest installation onto the ship that I have done yet. And that is it for this video. This is the penultimate video in the series of the construction of Roma. In the next video, I will build the RO-43 aircraft and install it onto the catapult. If you'd like to support the growth of this channel, please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers. You can see in the video that it's quite difficult to see the windows, especially when you zoom in like this because of the matte varnish. It makes the clear plastic very cloudy. I suppose I could try and scrape it off with a toothpick again, but I'm not so sure if I want to do that. I think there's quite a high risk of just damaging the paintwork and having a rather jagged edge that doesn't look nice.